The snow came harder than expected that winter, as if the mountains themselves were trying to erase every trace of the road behind her. The wind carried more than cold. It carried memory. Clara Byrne could feel it in the ache behind her eyes, the raw sting at her fingertips, the way the sky pressed down over the empty ridges like a weight no prayer could lift. She adjusted her scarf against the cold and pulled her boys closer, one under each arm, as they stood at the fork in the road. Behind them, only their footprints led back to nowhere. Ahead, nothing but whiteness, two diverging paths leading to two more questions she had no answer for. She looked down at Harlan, his cheeks pinked by wind, his nose red and leaking, and brushed his hair out of his face. His small mittened hand clutched hers with a grip that had not relaxed once in the last 3 days. Beside her, Emmett tried to square his little shoulders. He was 8, and the way he watched the hills, as if one might open into a better future, made her heart twist. She had not the heart to tell him that both roads ahead led to unknowns, and there were no guarantees in the white wilderness of a Colorado winter. Behind her glove, Clara touched her wedding ring. Cold now, like her husband's grave beneath the frosted earth of St. Elmo's Parish. The ring was all they had left that hadn't been taken by Silas Avery's clever legal filings and poisoned smiles. She had worn it every day since Jonathan slipped it on her finger beneath the old cottonwood tree the year the war ended. Now it was a relic, and yet she could not bring herself to take it off. The road bent into silence. The boys began to shiver. She was preparing to speak, to lie, most likely, and tell them help would come, when the wind brought something new, a sound not born of pine branches or grief, the faint rhythmic crunch of hooves. Her heart stuttered. She pulled her boys behind her like a mother fox shielding her kits. From the curtain of snow, a rider emerged. The horse was a thick-bodied bay gelding, snorting steam and moving carefully across the slick ground. Its rider wore a long coat heavy with snow and a wide-brimmed hat crusted with frost. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching in the snow. "Ma'am," he said, tipping the brim of his hat. His voice was rough but not harsh, the kind of voice that had been worn down by wind and quiet years. He took them in, the carpet bag, the cracked leather shoes on Emmett's feet, the trembling curve of Harlan's shoulders. "Maybe forward of me," he said, "but you folks look like you could use some shelter." Clara swallowed. Her throat was dry from days of cold wind, but pride burned just as hot as it always had. "We're quite all right," she answered. Her voice cracked at the edges. The stranger did not press. He reached down and gathered the reins of his horse, then looked back up with quiet eyes. "My place is over the ridge yonder. Modest, but it's warm. Got soup on the stove. No strings. Just figured it wouldn't sit right to pass you by with night coming on." Emmett shifted closer to her, his fingers tightening around her skirt. Then Harlan sneezed, the kind of sneeze that sounded too deep, too wet, and with that, Clara's pride cracked. She nodded once, sharply. "Thank you." The man nodded in return. "Name's Elias Mercer," he said. "Clara Byrne," she replied. "These are my sons, Emmett and Harlan." He didn't offer his hand, just a soft nod. "Let's get you inside." His ranch sat on the slope of a pine-covered ridge overlooking a flat pasture. Snow drifted up against the stone foundation of the house. A barn leaned slightly against the wind, like an old man with one bad knee, but the windows of the cabin glowed amber with lamplight, and as Elias pushed open the door, warmth spilled into the night. "Forgive the clutter," he said, setting aside his gloves. "Meant to tidy up. Didn't reckon on company." Clara ushered the boys in, her eyes darting over the room. It was clean in the way a solitary man's home often was. Ordered, lived in, and quiet. The smell of beans and salt pork rose from a cast-iron pot. The walls were lined not with trophies or trinkets, but books. Rows of them, hardbound volumes in faded cloth jackets, a few with foreign titles, some worn at the spine. The boys hesitated near the door. Elias nodded toward the hearth. "Come get warm. There's blankets by the rocker." They moved with cautious obedience, sitting on a rug near the fire, as if they didn't quite believe it was real. "I'll fetch more bedding," Elias said, disappearing into a back room. Clara crossed the room to help the boys remove their coats. She could feel heat returning to her fingers, and with it came the sting of returning sensation, the price of endurance. When Elias returned, he carried a faded quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. "My mother made this," he said, draping it over the boys. "Saved me more than once." She caught his eye. There was no boast in it, just memory. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, then gestured to the table. "You're welcome to what's on the stove. I'll pour." He did so without fuss. No questions about where they'd come from. No probing remarks. Just a man who moved like someone used to making space for silence. They ate in near quiet, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the occasional sniffle from Harlan. Afterward, Clara stood to help wash the bowls. "No need," Elias said. "You're guests." But she insisted. Her hands needed the work. That night, Elias laid out a pallet by the fire for himself, handing Clara a candle for the back bedroom. "Yours for the night." She hesitated at the threshold. Inside was a small bed, a bureau with a cracked mirror, and a simple nightstand. Upon it sat a worn Bible, and next to it, a charcoal sketch of a woman with kind eyes and an old-fashioned hairstyle. She turned back. "Your wife." He looked down. "A long time gone." She said nothing more. Neither did he. The boys crawled into the narrow bed, pulling the quilt up to their noses. Emmett was asleep within minutes, but Harlan whispered as she tucked him in. "Mama, is this our new home?" She smoothed his hair. "Hush, darling. We're just guests tonight." But even as she said it, Clara knew something in her had shifted. There was warmth in this house that went beyond the fire. It felt like a place where time might soften instead of wound. She blew out the candle and sat for a long while beside the bed. From the main room, she could hear Elias moving, quietly stoking the fire, rearranging logs, the soft creak of wood under his boots. It should have unnerved her. A stranger so close, while she and her boys slept with no locked door between them. But it didn't. It felt like the steady tick of a grandfather clock marking time's return after too long adrift. She lay beside her sons, eyes open, one hand resting on her ring. "Guide me," she whispered inwardly to the memory of her husband. "Help me protect them." Outside, the wind clawed at the windows. Inside, the house stood strong. The snow came harder than expected that winter, but perhaps not harder than hope. "Mama," Harlan whispered, curling close beneath the quilt. "Is this our new home?" Clara didn't answer, but in her heart, something had already begun to thaw. Some men wear their past like a badge. Elias Mercer had buried his where even the wind wouldn't find it. The morning came thin and pale, sunlight stretching across frost-covered earth like fingers reluctant to wake the land. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a strange stillness that filled every hollow and branch. Clara stood by the small kitchen window, watching how the light shifted over the frozen pasture beyond. The boys were still asleep, curled together beneath the old quilt Elias had given them. For the first time in days, their breathing was soft and steady. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved toward the stove. The fire from last night had been banked expertly, embers still glowing. She added a split log, careful not to rattle the metal too loudly, and poured water from the kettle into a tin mug. Steam rose gently, curling into the quiet air. On the table beside the stove sat a thick ledger, its cracked spine open to neat columns written in an even hand. She hadn't noticed it the night before, too weary to see anything beyond warmth and soup. Now she ran a fingertip over the pencil strokes. The calculations were exact. Numbers for hay bales, cattle feed, winter stores. The entries stretched back over months, maybe years, not the scrawl of a lonely frontiersman barely keeping up. These were the records of a man who kept his life ordered. Footsteps behind her. She turned. "Coffee's hot," Elias said, brushing snow from his shoulders as he stepped inside from the back porch. "Bread's from yesterday, if you're hungry." He moved without fuss, setting down a bucket near the door. The cold clung to him, but he moved like a man used to it, his fingers stiff but sure as he peeled off his gloves and hung his coat near the stove. His shirt collar was slightly askew. Clara noticed the edge of a scar peeking just above it, small, pale, and old. "You keep very precise records," she said, nodding toward the ledger. Elias poured himself a cup and joined her at the table. He removed a pair of spectacles from his pocket, thin wire-rimmed, and slid them on. "Have to," he said. "Ranch this size, every penny counts, every bale of hay, every broken fence rail. Can't afford mistakes." Clara studied him for a long moment. He looked different in the morning light, more human than myth. His face worn, yes, but not hard. A man carved by time, not bitterness. Before she could ask more, small footsteps pattered across the wooden floor. Harlan emerged from the bedroom still wrapped in the quilt, his eyes barely open. "Mama, I smelled bread." Elias's face softened. "How about you help me feed the chickens first, young man? Earn that breakfast proper." Harlan hesitated, then looked to Clara for permission. She nodded, warmed by her son's eagerness. "Go on if you like." Elias offered his hand, and Harlan took it without hesitation. They disappeared out the back door into the crisp morning. Clara poured another cup of coffee and returned to the ledger. She didn't mean to pry, but something in the columns spoke to her. The order, the care. Elias Mercer wasn't just surviving, he was building something. Emmett appeared not long after, rubbing sleep from his eyes and tugging his boots on without complaint. He sat beside his mother while she handed him a slice of bread and a small smear of cold butter. The boy ate quickly, then paused. "Is it all right if I go help too?" he asked. "Elias said you'd be good with the bigger chores," she said, brushing crumbs from his sleeve. "I think he's right." A slow smile crept across the boy's face. Outside, Clara watched through the frosted glass as Elias and the boys moved across the yard, Harlan pointing at chickens, Emmett standing a little straighter when Elias handed him a shovel. She stood there for a long while, her arms crossed, heart tugging in strange directions. Once the boys were fully occupied, she turned back to the quiet main room. The sun had risen higher, casting long bars of golden light through the front windows. She explored the space more deeply now, her steps slow, curious, respectful. The bookshelf caught her attention again. She trailed her fingers along the spines, volumes of Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and poetry she hadn't seen since her school days. Mixed among them were practical manuals, animal husbandry, crop rotation, architectural drawings. A battered copy of Euclid's Elements bore a handwritten name inside the cover. E. Mercer, University of Pennsylvania, 1868. So he had once belonged to another world entirely. In the corner stood a modest writing desk. She opened a drawer. Inside were letters, tied with string, their pages yellowed with time. Not legal documents or ledgers, but letters written in a delicate, feminine hand. She did not read them, but she saw the name Elizabeth signed at the bottom of one, and that was enough. The floorboards creaked behind her. She turned. Elias stood in the doorway, one glove still on, a quiet look on his face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "No harm done." He stepped forward and opened the drawer beside her, pulled out one of the letters. "I was studying to be a professor once," he said. "If you can believe it. Life had other plans." He sat down in the chair beside the desk, letter still in hand. "What changed?" she asked. He ran his thumb over the crease in the paper. "War came. Then loss. Then this place. Sometimes the quiet of the mountains heals better than all the books in the world." Emmett entered just then, shaking snow from his shoulders. "Could you teach us?" he asked, surprising them both. "About the books?" Elias looked at Clara. "I reckon I could, if your mama approves." Clara didn't answer right away. She watched the boy's face, his wide eyes, his hunger for something more than survival. "Yes," she said quietly. "It would be good for them to learn." Elias stood and tucked the letter away. "Been a long while since I had anyone to share these old volumes with." The day passed slowly, but not without purpose. The boys helped stack firewood and gathered eggs. Elias taught Emmett how to check a fence line for signs of sagging. Harlan carried a small bucket of oats with solemn pride. Clara, for the first time in weeks, kneaded bread in a warm kitchen, not driven by panic. She watched her sons from the window, and something inside her settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she missed. Then, as the sun began to slide westward, the distant sound of horses disrupted the peace. Not one. 3. Elias was outside with Emmett, working near the fence. Clara grabbed Harlan's hand and pulled him inside. She watched through the window as the riders approached. Their movements were calm, but practiced. Men who carried weight in their saddle. The first wore a silver badge. Sheriff Holden Morton reined in his horse near the front yard. Beside him rode a narrow-faced man with a smirk too wide for his own good, Deputy Lem Bales. And behind them, on a smaller gelding, sat Ezra Coyle from the general store in town. Elias stood straight, body calm. He positioned himself subtly between the house and the men. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he said. Morton nodded. "Notice you've had steady smoke from your chimney all week. Not usual for a man living alone." "Winter's cold," Elias replied. "Been staying in more than usual." "That so?" Bales leaned forward in his saddle. "Thought I saw a woman's wash on the line yesterday. Seemed strange." Clara's hand clenched tighter on Harlan's shoulder. The boy stayed quiet. Still. Outside, Elias didn't move. "Guests," he said. "A widow and her sons. Caught out in the storm. I wasn't about to let them freeze." Coyle clicked his tongue. "Mighty charitable of you, Mercer. Most charity comes through church or aid society. There's nothing untoward about offering Christian kindness to those in need." The sheriff dismounted. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "No law against kindness," he said. "But we've had trouble before. Drifters, swindlers. You're vouching for these folks?" Elias nodded once. "I am. And I'd appreciate if you mind how you speak of them. Mrs. Byrne is a lady of quality. Her boys are as well-mannered as any you'd find in Denver's finest homes." Something in his voice rang true. The sheriff's posture softened slightly. "Well then," he said, "suppose we should meet the lady proper." Clara stood straighter. She smoothed her skirt, fixed her hair with one hand, and stepped out onto the porch. "Gentlemen," she said. Her voice held the cadence of memory. Denver balls, church socials, evenings with her husband in the parlor. "I'm Clara Byrne. My sons and I are indeed guests of Mr. Mercer's kindness, though we won't impose longer than necessary." Morton studied her. "Boy's father?" "Taken by fever this past autumn," she said calmly. "My brother-in-law's management of the estate left us, limited in options." Ezra shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Morton gave a slow nod. "Welcome to the county, Mrs. Byrne, though you might consider more conventional lodging once the weather turns." Mrs. I. Peterson at the boarding house. She takes in respectable ladies. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep that in mind. Morton tipped his hat. Good day. They rode off without further word. Elias remained by the fence, his back a wall of quiet strength. When he turned back to the house, Clara saw something in his face that surprised her. Not shame or anger, but a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. Later that night, Elias stares at the empty fireplace, fingers tracing the broken pocket watch. You would have liked them, he whispers to no one. In the high country, storms come without warning, like grief, like reckoning. The sun had risen thin and pale behind a veil of frost, but by mid-morning it had disappeared behind a wall of gray clouds rolling low across the mountain peaks. Elias had seen it before, the way the sky shifts, the stillness that settles before the first flakes fall, the eerie hush that descends over the land, like a held breath. He stood in the field beyond the barn with Emmett, showing him how to mend a broken length of wire on the south fence. Clara and Harlan were on the back porch, shelling dried beans, the quiet rhythm of their work drifting faintly over the frozen yard. A sense of calm had settled across the homestead in recent days. The rhythm of chores, meals, and shared silence had taken root like winter wheat beneath the snow. But Elias knew better than to trust the quiet. He squinted toward the ridge, then lowered the fencing pliers. We need to finish this quick, he said. Sky's changing. Emmett followed his gaze. Looks like a storm. It is. The boy nodded, accepting the assessment without fear. He had a stillness to him when he worked, thoughtful and focused, just like his father had once been. The memory came uninvited, like a cold wind slipping past the collar. Elias pushed it aside. They worked another 15 minutes, Emmett practicing his knots, Elias inspecting the brace posts. Then Emmett looked up suddenly, his breath visible in the sharp air. The new calf, he said. She's still in the far pasture. Elias frowned. She'll find her way in. She's real small. She might not. The boy's voice carried the same steady tone, but beneath it was a current of something deeper, a quiet resolve. Elias pulled out his pocket watch. The glass was scratched, the hands frozen at 3:15 from an old accident he didn't talk about, but he still carried it. The chain still worked. The weight of it in his palm felt heavier now. We've got maybe 20 minutes, he said. If the wind comes fast, less. Emmett didn't flinch. Then we should go. Elias hesitated. He could tell the boy to stay back, could ride out alone. But Emmett was no longer a child trailing behind. Not today. Then we go together, Elias said. He turned toward the house and called out to Clara, who stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. We're going after the calf, Elias said. Storm's close. Keep Harlan inside. Clara's eyes flicked to the sky. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. She saw what Elias saw. The urgency, the risk, and the decision already made. Be careful, she said. Her voice held more than concern. It carried history, loss. Elias gave a brief nod, mounted the gelding, and reached down to pull Emmett up behind him. The boy gripped his waist without hesitation. They rode fast across the pasture. Snow crunching beneath the hooves, wind beginning to howl through the trees. By the time they reached the far paddock, visibility had dropped. The calf stood alone, huddled against the broken post where the fence bowed inward. Her mother was nowhere in sight. Elias dismounted and handed Emmett the reins. Keep him steady, he said. Don't let him spook. Emmett nodded, holding the reins tightly, his breath fogging in the cold. Elias approached the calf slowly, speaking low, steady nonsense to calm the creature. His movements were deliberate, boots crunching in snow, coat whipping in the wind. The calf turned toward him, ears twitching. Behind him, the horse shifted. That's when it happened. A sudden blast of wind, a howling shriek across the plain, spooked the gelding. The horse reared. Emmet's grip slipped. A panicked cry cut through the storm as the reins yanked away. Elias turned just in time to see Emmet stumble backward, the horse's hooves crashing dangerously close. Instinct took over. He dove, arms wrapping around the boy, shielding him as they hit the ground. A jolt of pain burst through his chest. The watch in his pocket crushed between them. The gelding bolted, disappearing into the white. They lay there for a moment in the snow, both gasping. The wind screamed overhead. "You hurt?" Elias asked, voice rough with pain. "No, sir," Emmet said. "You?" Elias nodded once, slow. "Nothing broken that won't mend." The calf was gone. Likely found her mother. Elias sat up and looked around. Snow blinded every direction. "We need to move," he said. Emmet didn't hesitate. He stood, brushed snow from his coat, and reached down to help Elias. They walked. The wind cut sideways across the open field, slicing through every layer of wool and flannel. Elias kept one hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward. There were no landmarks, no shadows to follow. Only white. Endless white. Time disappeared. Steps blurred into steps. Then, a shape. A dark square against the snow. The barn. They'd walked in a wide arc. By grace or instinct, they had circled back. Elias pulled the barn door open and shoved Emmet inside, slamming it shut behind them. The wind howled in protest. And then, voices. "James! Elias!" Clara's call rang through the storm, sharp and clear. "We're in the barn!" Elias shouted. Moments later, the door opened again, and Clara stood there with Harlan, lantern raised. Her eyes locked on Emmet, then on Elias, and something in her face broke. Relief, fear, love. Emmet ran to her, and she dropped to her knees, clutching both boys close. Elias leaned against the barn wall, trying to catch his breath. The pain in his chest flared as he reached into his coat and pulled out the crushed pocket watch. The glass was shattered, the hands bent. The chain still clung to the dented case. He turned it over in his palm. Clara approached slowly. "Your father's?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Last thing he gave me before I left for the university. Told me to make every minute count." She touched the broken face gently. "I'd say you honored his words today." They locked eyes then. No further need for words. The storm outside roared like a beast trying to reclaim what had escaped its jaws. But inside the barn, there was only the quiet rhythm of breath, the soft cluck of roosting hens, and the warmth of bodies pressed close. Later, they built a small nest of hay in the loft. The boys drifted to sleep beneath the quilt, their faces still flushed with cold and adventure. Elias sat at the edge, the watch resting in his palm, its weight unfamiliar now. Clara sat beside him. "Emmet was brave," he said. "He's never been in a storm like that," she whispered. "He never hesitated. You didn't either." He looked at her then. Not just looked, but saw her, in the dim lantern light, her face shadowed by more than time. She met his gaze. "You risked your life for him," she said. "I would again." Quiet fell between them, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. When Clara rose to check the boys, Elias remained still, watching her hands brush Harlan's hair from his face with that same tender steadiness she always carried. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind battering the outside walls. But it couldn't reach them here. Not tonight. That night, Clara whispers into the dark. "We're not just surviving anymore, are we?" The wind doesn't answer, but Elias's quiet footsteps outside the door do. Some truths don't shout. They wait, buried like fence posts in winter, forgotten until a thaw lays them bare. By the time spring crept over the ridge, dry Cedar Bluff town had begun to stir again. The rivers ran louder, swollen with meltwater, and the hills wore green like a forgotten dress pulled from a cedar chest. Clara stood at the edge of Elias's porch, watching the boys chase one another between patches of snow and mud. Harlan's laughter rose sharp and sweet. Emmett's strides longer now, more sure-footed. The season had changed more than just the land. She held the edge of her shawl closed against the breeze, her gaze drifting toward the distant town where the steeple of St. Matthew's leaned slightly eastward. It was the first time in months she'd thought of going back, not to her in-laws, not to the house that no longer belonged to her, but to the town itself, to its people, and the ghosts that lingered in its corners. Elias joined her on the porch, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. "You're quiet," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained on the distant silhouette of the town. "Silas Avery filed a claim against me last week," she said softly. "Through a contact in St. Elmo's. I read it in a letter from a friend I thought had forgotten me." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "He after land or reputation?" "Both," she said. "Says Jonathan's will was altered. Claims I coerced it. He's accusing me of fraud. Said I wasn't his brother's legal wife. That the children—" She swallowed. "That they're not heirs." Elias said nothing for a long time. The wind caught the corner of his coat, lifting it gently, like a hand pulling at memory. "He's bluffing," he said finally. "He wants to scare you into walking away." "He's succeeding," Clara whispered. But she didn't move. She stayed on that porch, her shoulders straight despite the tremble in her fingers. Later that afternoon, Emmett found something half buried in the yard near the barn, an old wooden sign, worn to the grain, with faint lettering that read Montgomery Parish Station. He dragged it inside with a boy's pride, showing off his find. "Was this a mail stop?" he asked. Elias looked at it a long moment before nodding. "Used to be. Long before I got here. Stage ran through here in the 1860s. That barn was a stopover. Horses changed, telegrams relayed. Then the rails came. And folks forgot about it." Clara knelt beside the sign, brushing away the caked dirt from its corners. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "So much forgotten." She looked up. "Do you mind if I keep it?" Elias's smile was faint, but warm. "Think it was waiting to be found." That evening, the boys painted the old sign in dark blue and gold, giggling at how the letters began to reappear beneath their brushes. It wasn't about the words. It was about reclaiming something that had almost disappeared. But that same night, Elias found a letter in his post box near the road, unmarked, no return address. The handwriting was familiar. He opened it by lamplight inside the quiet of his study. "Mr. Mercer, word travels. We understand you're harboring a woman and her boys, ones with unfinished business in St. Elmo's. You may not recall the past you left behind, but some of us do. You'd be wise to remember the cost of misplaced trust." A friend. He folded the letter and placed it inside the drawer beside his revolver. The next morning, Elias saddled the horse and rode out before dawn. Clara found the note on the kitchen table. "To town, back before supper." She didn't question it aloud, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded the parchment. In town, Elias didn't stop at the general store or the saloon. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped into the warmth of oil lamps and stale coffee. Sheriff Morton looked up from behind his desk. "Well now," he said, "didn't expect to see you till branding season." Elias handed him the folded letter. Morton read it twice. His brows lowered. "Anonymous?" "Huh. Not entirely," Elias said. "I know the hand." "You accusing someone?" "I'm asking if you'll be ready if trouble comes." Morton leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Trouble tends to come looking for what it wants. Sometimes it finds more than it bargained for. Elias didn't smile. "You gonna stand in its way?" The sheriff looked up at him a long time before nodding once. "I will." Elias tipped his hat and left, but trouble came sooner than expected. It arrived 3 days later, wearing a clean suit and a preacher's smile. Silas Avery rode into Dry Cedar Bluff with 2 men, one thin and sharp-eyed, the other heavy-set and silent. They tethered their horses outside the town hall and walked straight into the recorder's office with a satchel full of documents. When they emerged, the air in the town had changed. Elias saw them from across the street. Clara stood beside him, having just stepped out of Mrs. Weaver's sewing shop. She stiffened, her spine turning to iron. Silas looked straight at her, and for a brief moment his smile faltered, but it returned quickly. "Well, if it isn't the Widow Byrne," he said, tipping his hat as if they were still civilized folk. "What a surprise to find you here." Clara's voice didn't waver. "It shouldn't be. I've nothing to hide." "No," Silas said, his gaze turning. "But some things do have a way of being misunderstood." He turned to Elias then. "And you must be the rancher. Hosting ladies in distress. Defending lost causes. That used to be your brother's job, wasn't it?" Elias didn't move. "Get to your point," he said. Silas smiled wider. "My point is this. I've filed with the county. Her claim to Jonathan's estate is under review. She'll be required to appear in St. Elmo's next month, and anyone impeding that process may find themselves on the wrong side of the law." He tipped his hat again and walked on, his men trailing behind. The street fell silent. Clara turned to Elias. "He's going to destroy everything." Elias watched Silas disappear down the road. "Only if we let him." That night, Elias unlocked the drawer he rarely opened. Inside was more than just the revolver and letters. There was a sealed envelope marked James Elias Mercer, personal in his late brother's hand. He stared at it for a long while, the weight of history pressing down on his chest. When he opened it, his breath caught. It was a copy of Jonathan's original will, unaltered. Signed and witnessed. A single line underlined in the familiar scrawl, "I leave my estate in full to my lawful wife, Clara Byrne Mercer, and my sons, Emmett and Harlan." The proof he hadn't known he held. All these months, he'd buried it with the past. Clara found him sitting in the dark, the paper trembling in his hands. "I never read it," he said. "It came after the funeral. I was angry. I put it away." She took the paper and read it silently. When her eyes lifted, there was more than relief. There was grief, love, and something Elias hadn't seen before. "Then it's over," she whispered, but Elias shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." Down in St. Elmo's, Silas Avery receives a telegram from the county clerk. He reads the words once, then crushes the paper in his fist. "They found the will," he mutters. "That damn rancher found it." Some men carve justice with a badge. Others carry it like a wound that never healed. The early morning in Dry Cedar Bluff settled in with a stillness too perfect to last, the kind of quiet that made the crows hold their breath and the dogs pace behind fences. Elias stood alone near the edge of the back field, the frost crunching beneath his boots, the will clutched tight in his gloved hand. He hadn't slept. Neither had Clara. The paper in his grasp might prove the truth, but the law had never been simple. Not here. Not in a town where power bent rules like heat warps old glass. Inside the house, Clara prepared the boys for the trip. St. Elmo's was a half-day's ride, and the hearing was set for noon. She packed a satchel with letters, a photograph of her wedding day, and her marriage certificate. Her hands shook only once, when she folded a handkerchief embroidered with the initials CBM, a gift from Jonathan on the first Christmas they spent as husband and wife. Emmett watched her from the doorway, silent and solemn. Clara turned and managed a faint smile. "You'll stay here," she said, brushing his hair with her fingers. "Watch your brother. Mind the barn. Elias and I can handle this." Emmett didn't answer right away. He stared out the window toward the barn, the town, the far-off hills. "People in town," he said finally. "They talk like Silas is someone to fear." Clara's smile didn't falter, but her voice softened. "Only if you let him be." By 8, Elias had hitched the wagon. Clara emerged wrapped in her dark blue cloak, face composed, eyes steady. Elias helped her up, then climbed beside her. The boys stood by the porch, Harlan waving with both arms. As the wagon rolled onto the frozen road, Clara reached into her coat and touched the pocket where the will rested. She could feel the folded edges beneath her fingertips, like the ridges of a scar. They passed the sign Emmett had painted. Montgomery Parish Station now hung from the edge of the porch, its bold gold letters catching the morning light. Clara looked back only once. St. Elmo's rose up from the edge of the river, a narrow town built from timber and pride. The streets buzzed with market vendors and wagon wheels, but when Elias and Clara stepped down near the courthouse, heads turned. Whispers carried fast. "She came. Thought she'd run. That's the Mercer man." Inside, the room smelled of dust and ink. The courtroom was modest. No grand arches or marble steps, just wooden benches, a judge's chair, and silence that weighed more than stone. Silas Avery stood near the front, flanked by his lawyer and 2 of his men. His eyes tracked Clara the moment she entered. He offered a smile, meant to appear gracious, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed calculation. Judge Whitcomb entered without ceremony, an old man with brittle hands and a gaze like chipped flint. "Let's keep this brief," he muttered, settling behind the desk. "I've a railway claim to hear by sundown." The proceedings began. Silas's lawyer stood first, speaking of inconsistencies, of missing documents, of the widow's questionable standing. He waved vaguely toward Elias, citing the undue influence of an unrelated male figure. The words hung heavy in the air. Then it was Clara's turn. She stepped forward, the will in her hands. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke of Jonathan, of their marriage, of the children, of the grief. She showed the original marriage certificate, the birth records of the boys, and finally, the signed, witnessed will. She handed it to the judge without ceremony. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Whitcomb read the will, his lips moving silently. Silas shifted beside his lawyer. Whitcomb looked up. "This appears to be in order." Silas's voice snapped through the quiet. "Your Honor, that document was not presented in earlier filings. It may be forged." Clara turned, her gaze steady. "It was sealed in a letter Jonathan sent Elias before he passed. It remained unopened until last week." Whitcomb examined the envelope, the seal, the handwriting. "Recognize this hand, Mr. Avery?" he asked. Silas hesitated. Yes or no?" "Yes." The judge sat back. "Then I find no reason to question the document's authenticity." The ruling was swift. Clara Byrne Mercer's rights were upheld. Her children recognized as legitimate heirs. Silas's petition dismissed. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Silas didn't speak. He stood, jaw clenched, and left the room before anyone could stop him. His lawyer followed, papers still clutched in hand. Clara exhaled slowly. Her knees trembled, but her voice remained calm. "Thank you, Your Honor." Elias helped her down from the front of the courthouse steps into a new world, one that for the first time in months wasn't shaped by fear. But peace is never left alone for long. As they returned to the wagon, a boy no older than 12 sprinted down the road, breathless. "Mr. Mercer," he shouted, "it's your ranch. Someone set the barn ablaze." Elias didn't speak. He climbed into the driver's seat with Clara beside him and snapped the reins hard. The horse bolted forward, the wagon bouncing over the rutted road as they raced toward home. Smoke bloomed above the ridgeline, thick and black against the pale sky. By the time they reached the property, the barn was engulfed. Emmett stood nearby, holding Harlan, both boys coated in ash. His eyes were wide, clothes singed at the edges. "We tried," he gasped. "We threw snow, buckets. Couldn't stop it." Elias jumped down and ran toward the shed where he kept the pump. But it was too late. The barn groaned once, then collapsed inward, flames devouring the last of the rafters. Clara ran to her sons, wrapping them in her arms. Harlan sobbed into her dress. Emmett turned to Elias. "I saw them," he said. "Two men. I didn't recognize one. The other," he paused, "was the same man who came to town with Silas." Elias's fists clenched. Clara stood, lifting her head slowly to face the blaze. "The will was never his target," she whispered. "It was us." That night, as the ashes still smolder, Emmett kneels where the barn once stood and finds something half buried in the dirt. A burnt piece of wood, shaped like a cross, etched faintly with the words, "Forgive the silence." Some endings arrive without thunder or fanfare. Just a wind shift, a last light across the field, and a voice choosing not to stay silent anymore. Dawn crawled in slow across the charred ruins of the barn, and with it came a quiet, not unlike morning. The beams still smoked, faintly glowing beneath ash. Clara stood at the edge of the wreckage, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her boots planted firm in soil now blackened. The boys were inside the house, still sleeping, though neither had truly rested. The fire had stolen more than lumber and livestock. It had taken the illusion that they could live untouched out here, past the town's reach, past Silas's shadow. Elias stepped beside her, his face lined by more than age. He hadn't spoken much since the night before. After dousing what flames they could, they had worked in silence, side by side, as they always had. But something in him had shifted, not rage, but resolve, calm and dangerous like a frozen river about to crack. "Town won't help," he said at last. "Even Morton's hands are tied. Unless someone's caught red-handed, no one'll point fingers." Clara nodded slowly. "Then we bring the truth where it can't be ignored." Later that morning, Elias hitched the wagon again. Clara rode beside him, this time holding more than documents. She carried the scorched board Emmett had found, the faint etching still visible. Forgive the silence. It wasn't a message. It was a confession. St. Elmo's was louder this time, busier. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in small places. The fire, the will, the ruling, and now the return of Clara Mercer and Elias. A crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office by mid-morning. Inside, Elias placed the charred board on Morton's desk. "Someone's trying to bury more than a claim," he said, "and they left their signature behind." Morton examined the piece carefully. "I've seen this mark before," he muttered. "Used to be scratched into fence posts along the North Ridge, back when the Avery men patrolled their property, like it was a kingdom." Clara leaned in. "It's not just a warning. It's a lie they passed among themselves to justify the silence, to stay out of each other's wrongdoings." Morton sighed and leaned back. "I can't arrest a man on wood and smoke." "You don't have to," Elias said. "Just call a town meeting. Let them hear." The sheriff looked at them long and hard, then nodded. That evening, the townspeople gathered at the chapel, not for sermon or song, but for reckoning. The benches filled slowly, some standing in the aisles, others watching from the open windows. Elias stepped to the front, removing his hat, his face solemn beneath the lamplight. "I came here years ago," he said, "to forget, to build quiet, and I kept my head down, thinking if I stayed out of town troubles they'd stay out of mine." He held up the charred board. "That was a mistake." He set it on the altar. "Last night my barn was burned down. My sons could have been in it. Clara's boys. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. It wasn't lightning, wasn't accident. It was fear, cloaked in power. It was silence passed down, like inheritance. Clara stepped forward next, holding the will and her marriage certificate. "I came to this town with nothing but truth," she said. "And still I was made to feel as if I didn't belong. I was told my children were illegitimate, that my name meant less because someone with more land said so." She looked across the faces. "I've survived worse, but I will not teach my sons that silence is safer than standing." A murmur swept the room. Then a voice rose. Old Mrs. Kinley from the mill, sharp and shaking. "She's right. We've watched them Avery men get away with too much, too long. I remember what they did to the Trumbull boy. Sheriff looked the other way then, too." Another voice added, "They burned down the Miller's shed in '82, never got caught." The tide shifted, slow but certain. The room turned. By the time Morton rose, he didn't have to say much. "We'll open a full inquiry," he said. "Silas Avery'll be questioned, and if he's guilty, he'll answer for it." Same as any man. It was all they could ask for. The next morning, Elias found Clara on the porch, watching the boys work where the barn had once stood. They had gathered charred nails into a wooden pail and were stacking unburnt boards like puzzle pieces. Neither complained. Neither asked why. "Starting again," she said quietly. He nodded. "Always." She reached into her pocket and handed him something, a silver chain, cleaned and straightened. "It's yours," she said. The watch case was dented, but the chain was whole. Elias smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd see this again." Neither did I. Later that day, a wagon arrived from town, carrying supplies. Behind it rode Morton with 2 deputies, and, to everyone's surprise, Silas Avery, hands bound, face blank. The sheriff dismounted, nodded to Elias and Clara. "Found more than a few things in his ledger," he said. "Bribes, threats, and a letter asking someone to take care of your barn problem." Elias looked at Silas, who met his gaze with something between shame and fury. "You won't break this family," Elias said quietly. "You never had a family," Silas spat. "Only strays and ghosts." Elias stepped forward, slowly, until their boots nearly touched. "Strays know how to survive. Ghosts remember everything." Silas looked away. As the wagon turned toward the county line, Clara stood beside Elias, the wind lifting her hair gently from her face. "Will it end here?" she asked. Elias didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally, "but it'll begin again here. Better this time." That night, Emmett placed a new signpost in the ground near the house. The same words, but beneath it, one more line carved in careful hand. Mercer Family Ranch, Est, 1885. In the last light of evening, Clara wrote a final entry in her journal. "I have walked through fire, silence, and snow. I have tasted loss and love, and watched 2 boys become men before my eyes. The wind still howls, but it no longer carries fear. The town no longer looks away, and I am no longer alone. Some truths do not need to be shouted. They simply need to be lived." And so the wind moves again across dry Cedar Bluff, slow and full of memory, stirring up the dust and the ghosts that lie beneath it, carrying the scent of scorched timber and sweet prairie grass in equal measure, as if the land remembers everything, every silence, every spoken vow, every cry that went unanswered for too long, and every voice that finally broke through the hush. The barn is gone, but in its place rises something quieter, stronger, shaped by fire and forgiven by time, while the boys who once stood in the shadow of fear now walk side by side in the light of morning, carrying tools, not burdens, and laughter, not shame. A woman sits on a porch worn soft by seasons and by watching, her hands no longer shaking as they stitch the final piece of a life torn by grief and sewn back by grit. Her shawl lifts gently in the wind, the same wind that rattles the old weather vane and whispers against the pages of her journal left open on the table, its lines filled not with complaints or revenge, but with gratitude, names, and the things worth remembering. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings once, hollow but whole, and the horses in the field raise their heads as if they understand that something has shifted, that the silence no longer belongs to the powerful alone. At the edge of the property, wildflowers bloom where the ashes once lay thick, and a small wooden sign stands upright, words carved with care and reverence, Mercer Family Ranch, Est, 1885, and beneath it, another, Forgive the silence. The town still watches, but no longer with suspicion, instead with respect earned through trials, through standing firm when it would have been easier to walk away, through choosing kindness even when it meant facing cruelty head on. Elias no longer walks with a shadowed heart, for what he buried long ago has been spoken aloud, and what he feared to feel again has returned, not as pain, but as purpose. And Clara, the woman forgotten by courts and kin, the widow cast out by those who spoke her husband's name without meaning it, has become something larger than her sorrow. She is the keeper of legacy, the mother of sons who know love isn't weakness, and the voice of women who once said nothing and now are learning to say enough. The wind carries the sound of her voice now, though she speaks it only once, softly, in the language of forgiveness, and still it echoes like hymn across the canyons and open plains. There are letters in a drawer never sent, and medals that rusted long before they were earned, but none of it is lost, not truly, for every forgotten truth waits patiently beneath the surface, needing only one hand brave enough to dig. Sometimes, the only proof you'll ever get is your own survival, and sometimes, that's all the world needs to believe you were right all along. The oil lamp burns low, its glow gold and trembling, like a memory too sacred to extinguish, casting shadows that dance against the walls where children once cried and now sleep safe. The old watch ticks again, repaired, its time slow and steady, and the night carries no storm, only stars overhead that seem closer than before. If you've ever loved someone in silence, if you've ever stood for truth while the world walked away, if you've ever held a memory like a flame in the wind and refused to let it die, then leave a sign that you're still listening. Click the heart if the story settled somewhere quiet inside you. Subscribe to our channel to hear the next tale from a time when dignity walked on dust-covered roads, when honor could be lost and found again by lantern light, and when one forgotten woman taught a town how to remember what matters most. Because the truth doesn't need a crowd, it only needs someone to keep it. And maybe that someone is still you.